Welcome to day one of the American Society of Adaptation Professionals Climate Migration Workshop, Preparing Receiving Communities. The topic for today's workshop is In-Migration Methodologies and Understanding Climate Receiving Communities. We want to respect everyone's time, so we're going to go ahead and get started even as our room continues to fill up. Our topic today, the In-Migration Methodologies and Understanding Climate Receiving Communities, is going to be an opportunity for you to hear about climate in-migration methodologies developed through ASAP programs, specifically our New York State Climate Migration Methodology Accelerator, and to learn about potential migration into and out of the Great Lakes region and through New York State. My name is Beth Gibbons. I'm the Executive Director at the American Society of Adaptation Professionals. I live in Southeast Michigan on the contemporary and ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe people, who are the three Fires people made up of Ottawa, Ojibwa, and Potawatomi, and the Wyandot. Today, the city where I live in is called Ypsilanti, Michigan. For the past decade, I've worked on climate change adaptation in the Great Lakes region, and the question of how our region is adapting and will continue to adapt is one that I care deeply about as both an adaptation professional and as someone who loves and calls this region home. For me, it's been an absolute joy to learn from and alongside many of the outstanding community leaders, scholars, and practitioners through the ASAP climate migration work. Today, I'm grateful to have the opportunity to serve as your host and MC throughout day one of our two-day workshop, which will highlight ASAP's project work and equally, and really more importantly, the insights and expertise from a diverse voices from across our region who are thinking about climate migration as something new, but something we know is a core component of how we all are thinking about climate adaptation across North America and globally. So we know that climate migration will intensify as climate impacts worsen, but who will migrate? Where will those migrants go, and how will that migration affect people and livelihoods in both leaving communities and receiving communities? Over the next 2 days, we're going to explore these questions together through two themes. Our workshop split into day one and day two, and as I've shared, our day one workshop will discuss in-migration methodologies and understanding climate receiving regions. Here we'll be focusing on some ASAP-supported work, our New York State Climate Migration Methodology Accelerator, and we'll have an opportunity to hear from experts, from practitioners, and also have ample space to network with one another who are here in the room to explore what these questions mean for all of us. Tomorrow, in day two of our workshop, we'll be hearing about supporting effective in-migration planning. During these sessions, you'll have an opportunity to hear directly from practitioners, government staff, business leaders, and researchers. You'll have an opportunity to learn how climate in-migration is and will be influencing infrastructure, housing, and labor needs. And we hope that tomorrow you'll be coming away from that conversation able to identify approaches to unresolved questions that have come up in the climate migration research and practice. You'll come away with the ability to articulate the importance of centering affected communities in discussions about climate migration and describe important considerations for integrating in-migration information into decision-making. But before we get too far into the future, let's look at our day one agenda. So today we're in the midst of our welcome and ASAP orientation, which we'll be shifting to shortly. We're going to be kicking off our time together with networking breakouts, so an opportunity for you to find out who's in the room together. We're going to be hearing from a methodology team one on the integration of future displacement level events into existing age-segmented county-level migration models for the Great Lakes region. Our second methodology team will be talking about neighborhood livability and housing access for climate migrants across New York State. And then we'll be hearing about the perspectives, challenges, and data needs for climate and migration in the region. Now, I expect our room has filled up pretty well by now. I can see we have over 125 friends who have joined us. And so as you're coming into the room and spending time together, should you need support from the ASAP team, we have a robust group here ready to support you. via chat. If you have any challenges or questions, please reach out directly to Rachel Jacobson using a direct message. If you have more in-depth technical needs or end up getting kicked out of the session and need some support getting back in, please email Brianna Nels, ASAP's program manager, and she will be able to support you. Just a bit on our meeting norms and expectations for our time together. First, we invite you to please be present. In particular, we hope that you will keep your video on, especially when we go into our networking sessions. It will be an opportunity for you to interact, meet one another, and really bring this topic to life, hopefully deepening the lessons that we'll be working on sharing and also creating a greater learning environment for all of us. Make sure to take care of yourself while you're here. We've included a break in the middle of the day today, but if you need to step away to take care of your body, your brain, don't hesitate to do that. And lastly, please remember to take care and respect each other. At ASAP, we work to embody the values of trust and transparency, and we're going to be hoping that you will engage with us in that as well. So as we're in this room, please be sure to be muted when you're not speaking, and make sure to find a space to kind of give space and take space as we go through our networking sessions. For those who may not be familiar, I'm going to share a brief overview of ASAP before we dive into our migration content for today. So the American Society of Adaptation Professionals connects and supports climate change adaptation and resilience professionals to advance innovation and excellence in the field of practice. We believe climate change is a real and a serious danger to all sectors and systems, and that adaptation and resilience, when centered in equity and justice, will build stronger, more prepared communities, ecosystems, and economies. ASAP members are those who are out there building essential climate resilience for communities, ecosystems, economies across North America, and they come to ASAP and to the network to keep them connected, to share, learn, and accelerate our adaptation practices together. The strength of the ASAP network comes from its sectoral and regional diversity. We have members across North America, across the United States, in Canada, the Caribbean, and also global members. And our network is split across 4 sectors, from government to academia, nonprofit, and the for-profit sector. And when folks come into ASAP, they come here seeking to work with others who want to bridge across sectors in order to better understand how we integrate future climate information into our day-to-day decision-making. In addition to the individual members that make up ASAP, we also have a broad diversity of organizational members who come into ASAP, organizations which range from federal agencies to companies to nonprofits to academic institutions. Again, all coming here to seek out a place where they can face the challenges that climate change is posing to us, identify adaptation solutions, and to accelerate the implementation of those solutions through a shared network. And from ASAP, in order to facilitate that, we run 4 programs to build capacity building. Specifically, our climate migration program falls into the ASAP Connects program area. This program area is all about bringing adaptation professionals together in the issues that they care about so that they can more closely connect and to find similarities between what might seem like otherwise disparate work, but through working together, they can accelerate change more rapidly. I also want to highlight another one of our programs, which is within our ASAP Connects area, which is our member-led interest group on climate migration and managed retreat. This is one of our most robust member-led interest groups. It's been meeting for over 2 years, and it meets on a monthly basis. It's a group where you can go to learn about how ASAP members from around the world are talking about climate change migration and what it means in their work. Now, to tell you more about the migration work specifically at ASAP, I'm pleased to hand the mic over to Rachel Jacobson, ASAP's Deputy Director, who's going to share more about this body of work.
Thanks so much, Beth. So I'm Rachel Jacobson. I'm ASAP's Deputy Director. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm in Ann Arbor, Michigan, lands of the Anishinaabe and Wyandot peoples. So glad to be with you all this afternoon or this morning. So we began this work 18 months ago because we saw a gap in the growing work that researchers and practitioners were undertaking on climate migration, that very few people were thinking about or talking about receiving communities. And very few people were developing methodologies for predicting who will migrate, where those migrants will go, and how that migration may affect people and livelihoods for both migrants and the people in locations where they're moving. And we were thrilled to receive support from Great Lakes Integrated Sciences and Assessments and New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, and partner with experts including Matt Hauer, Missy Stoltz, Anna Morandi, Kelly Main, and others to begin to explore these questions. And to this incredible group of experts that we began collaborating with, we added ASAP's unique approach to climate adaptation challenges and opportunities, which includes our desire and our skills for fostering exchange, collaboration, and innovation between siloed areas of research and practice. And that is something that climate impacts and demography and migration certainly are currently siloed areas of research and practice. We added our commitment to involving end users from the beginning to shape the intentions and outcomes of this work, and our commitment to infusing principles of justice and equity, both in project design and implementation. And we added our desire and ability to see climate adaptation and climate migration as not just a source of challenges, but also a source of opportunity, and particularly an opportunity to vision and create the future that we wish to see. Next slide. So this work has three components. One is developing methodologies for predicting in-migration to the Great Lakes region and into and throughout New York State. The second component is gathering stakeholder and Indigenous rights holder perspectives to understand and center affected people in the conversation about in-migration. And the third component of this work for us is providing outreach and education opportunities to increase awareness and understanding of this topic. And all components of this project are really leading towards this desired outcome that ASAP has, of establishing the foundation for socially just and environmentally sound growth in climate receiving regions. Next slide. We are so grateful to our incredible contributors for the work we've been able to accomplish so far, both on methodology development and on gathering stakeholder and rights holder perspectives. We kicked off our methodology work with our 2020 workshop on climate-informed demography, and you can check out resources from that event coming right now through the chat. We held methodology learning labs throughout 2021, the result of which is the 3 methodologies to support predicting and preparing for climate migration, which you'll hear about later in today's session. And simultaneously, we've been exploring stakeholder and rights holder perspectives, beginning with a literature review that we published in early 2021, and you'll get the link to that in the chat shortly, and continuing with an array of conversations with people across the region representing communities, businesses, multiple scales of government, and others. And later today and tomorrow, we'll really be diving into and exploring some of the major themes that are emerging from that work in particular. And the sum total of all of these accomplishments and resources and collaborations is foundational knowledge on the topic of in-migration, new tools that can be applied both in the Great Lakes and New York State, as well as other climate receiving regions, and increased interest and ultimately investment and research into in-migration. Next slide. You'll be hearing much more about this throughout the workshop, but here is just this little short snapshot of some of the big takeaways from this work so far. So this topic is new. Climate migration in the US context is a new topic, and applied research on preparing receiving communities is particularly underdeveloped. This topic is complex. Demography might be fairly straightforward in terms of the methods that folks are using, but human action is complex and climate impacts are uncertain. And each individual decision maker is making unique migration decisions that make looking at this body of work really complex. It's also sensitive, and particularly questions of who controls data and how affected communities can lead conversations remain unsolved. And it's timely. Climate impacts we know are worsening. Recovery from COVID-19 could be a window of opportunity as people are experiencing migration and also visioning to move forward from COVID-19. And conversations on migration are really popular right now in the media, and we'll talk about some of the pros and cons of that. We also know that the Great Lakes region is not adequately prepared for climate and migration. There is some reluctance to growth. There is some fear that this new future topic will distract from current environmental and social justice issues that really need attention. And there is a lack of infrastructure to support growth, things such as housing, schools, healthcare, social support. And all of these realities tell us that we really need more resources for testing new approaches, collaborating across disciplines, and centering communities' needs and experiences in conversations and action. And that's what we're really excited about diving into throughout this workshop, and really working and thinking with you about how to move forward and take more action.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rachel. I think that's a great tee up as a background on where we are with this project, some of what we hope to be passing along, and then continuing to work on with all of you. And so we have a big group here, but we are going to go into breakouts because at ASAP, we really deeply, deeply value the opportunity to be in a smaller setting with one another, to exchange ideas, to learn from one another. And so your breakouts are going to be self-directed. There are not facilitators who will be joining. So when you go into your breakout rooms, we're asking for you to be following introductions where you'll be providing your name, your pronouns if you choose to, where you are located, and a land acknowledgement if you know it, the kind of work that you do, and what questions do you have about preparing receiving regions, and what do you hope to gain from the workshop? So Brianna Nels is prepping our breakout rooms, and I expect them to open up momentarily. You should see coming your way in the chat a Jamboard, which is a place where you can be dropping your ideas and also referencing for those leading questions. And we'll see you all back here in 10 minutes. If you have trouble getting into your breakout, we can find somebody who can give you some wayfinding. But at this point, you should have in front of you a little Zoom box that has popped up. It may say Brianna Nels is inviting you to room some number. We encourage you to go ahead and click on join and head on to your breakout rooms. We'll be here in the hallway helping you to find the room that's right for you. Hi, everyone. I hope that those networking sessions were a good time for you to introduce yourselves to one another and have an opportunity to start thinking aloud about what you're hoping to learn from this workshop and what some of the ideas, resources, and content are that you're bringing as experts in your own right in these conversations. So we're going to move now into our next section of the agenda. And in this section, we are going, first I want to introduce a tool that we're going to be using to be collecting questions from all of you as we go through our presentations today and also tomorrow. So we're going to be using a Slido. And in order to access Slido, you can go to slido.com and enter the code that you see here on the screen. We're also going to be sending a link in the chat that you can click on, and that will take you to Slido, and that is where you'll be able to submit your questions. Please include the name of the speaker who your question is for, and you'll be able to click on a thumbs up icon to upvote questions that maybe have already been asked that you want to make sure come up to the top of the list. And then our moderators will be using Slido in order to identify questions from all of you to bring to our panel discussions. So I think you should be seeing those links coming to you in the chat now. And I want to keep us moving right along. So much to cover today. And so it's without further ado that I'm so thrilled to introduce our first team of presenters, our methodology team 1, who will be talking about integrating projections of future extreme displacement level events into an existing age-segmented county-level migration model for the Great Lakes region. Hosting this session is Alex de Schabernen, and Alex is the Associate Director for Science and Application and the Senior Research Scientist at Season in the Earth Institute at Columbia University's Climate School. You can learn more about Alex and his incredible bio by going to the bio resource that was sent along with the meeting resources to all of you. Alex, so thank you so much for joining us, and I'm happy to hand things over to you.
Great, Beth, thank you so much. And you got my institutional name right, but my last name is Desherbinin, which is a complicated last name that derives from Russian originally, and so you're excused for that because it's a difficult one. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm really excited to hear what Matt and the team from Kimberly and William Ball from the Great Lakes Integrated Sciences Assessment will be speaking about. My name is Alex Sherman. As was mentioned, I'm at Columbia University, actually now the Climate School, which is a recent development. The Earth Institute has transitioned now into what's called the Climate School and actually has its own faculty and setup. So my interest is in climate migration and modeling. Work which I do largely internationally, but I think this work in the US is critical and really so eye-opening. So I'm really excited. I'm not going to say much more other than I'm from Mannahatta, which is the hilly island, which is the traditional homeland of the Lenape people. And my main job right now is to introduce Matt, Kimberly, and William Ball. So I'm going to introduce all three of you because I believe you have a combined presentation. And I have to get through this. Well, Matt and I have known each other for a number of years. I've been a huge fan of his work because he brings a demographer's precision and care about the data and care about demographic structure and other things to the topic of climate mobility. So I think we're going to learn a lot today. And folks, I've already sort of seen his presentation and it's very exciting. He's an assistant professor of sociology at Florida State University and a faculty affiliate at the Center for Demography and Population Health. His expertise is on the intersection of demography, migration, population projections, and climate change. We're going to learn more about that in a bit. The next presenter will be Kimberly Chanel, and I may be mispronouncing that. I'm frankifying it a little bit, making it sound a little more glamorous. So Kimberly is a climatologist at the Great Lakes Integrated Sciences and Assessment Center, or GLISA, and they're based at the University of Michigan. In this role, she supports GLISA projects and products tailoring climate information to meet the needs of their partners and stakeholders throughout the Great Lakes region. So we're going to be learning more about their work momentarily. And lastly, I guess it's BJ or William Ball researches the interactions between heavy precipitation events in the Midwestern United States and nitrogen movement in managing agriculture ecosystems. So without any further ado, I turn the floor over to Matt and team. Please use the Slido link, insert your questions as they arise, and we will get to them. You have a chance to upvote your fellow participants' questions if you think they're particularly pertinent. And so take a look at what others have written as well. Thanks so much. And over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Alex. Hopefully everyone can see my screen right now. It's really great to be here and present some of this work. I started doing this work in July, and I actually had two projects concurrently. So I'll talk about the modeling aspect, the first part, and then the second part will be about sort of the next steps, or where I can see this model integrating in a number of other areas. As Alex did say, I'm a demographer by training, and so I think about this as a demographer would in terms of age processes and so on. So what I'm going to present is a relatively flexible model for modeling climate migration in the US. And I'm going to focus in particular on sea level rise. That's where most of my expertise is and where I published previously. But then I can also envision this moving into other climate stressors as well, which we'll sort of talk about in the second half. So sort of like broadly speaking, climate migration and climate mobility is pretty popular. It's an area that it's garnished quite a bit of attention in the last 5 years or so. And there's been a lot of attempts to model this type of migration, but I think they suffer from two main drawbacks, and I'm very guilty of these drawbacks. So these are coming from self-reflection as well. The first is that when we think about migration, it's not just that we have people moving across space, that if 10 people move, then 10 people go to another area, and that's sort of the end of it. Instead, right, those people are going to be exposed to other population processes, and when they move, they can, if they're of certain ages, they can start families and have children, and they can be exposed to mortality. There can be a sort of like a gravity effect as well, where by virtue of moving, they're likely to attract other people to move, and so on. And so, to a certain extent, these sort of other feedbacks are very limited in past studies. And the second is that we really heavily focus on totals. So again, like 10 people moving, who are these people? Are they old people? Are they young people? Are they wealthy people? Are they poor people? Or, you know, what are we talking about in these areas? And I think that this is particularly important because just thinking very broadly about migration, the probability for anybody to move, or the migration propensity, is a very well-established age gradient. So what you're looking at here on this figure is the probability of migrating over the life course. And so that huge hump right in the middle, where migration probabilities are highest, correspond to young adults. And so essentially migration is very high when you're in your early 20s and your 30s, where you're moving for jobs and schooling and so on. And as you get settled into areas, your migration probabilities drop, and then to a low in your mid-70s or so, and before they start picking up again, you get a little bit of noise in the older age groups. And the red dot and the black dot correspond with the median ages for the US in 2020 and 2100. So what does this mean then, right? That we have this aging population in the US, and at the same time, the probability of migrating also is decreased. So could we end up with this idea of demographically stuck people? And if you look at the lack of feedback between the other demographic processes and the focus on aggregates, population totals, we kind of miss this sort of implication of what these might mean. We might have more people migrating than we thought, or we might have fewer, or there might be a larger or a smaller demographic impact, depending on how we tease these apart. So that's what I'm going to try and do today. And I'm going to try and go keep this at a very high level, and I'm going to try and move relatively quickly because I think that the results are important to look at. And I'll focus in particular towards the end on just New York as well. So to think about climate migration, then we need to have two parts. We have to have a migration model, so sort of like where people are moving. And we also have to have this sort of full demographic model as well. So when we integrate migrants and allow them to have children and so on in their life course. Here in most of this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on sea level rise, and then in the second part, heat and cold. But I think that the approach that I'm going to show can really be broadened to other climate hazards, so it's not just limited to something like sea level rise. And then I'll show again later on this sort of preliminary heat and cold results. So for the model we built, it's almost like a machine learning model, but not quite. We let the machine find the actual hazards, but we collected 40 years worth of population data for all the counties, and we looked for any kind of environmental event since 1980 that might have been associated with a large population decline. So you can think of Hurricane Katrina being a classic example of this. Hurricane Sandy in the New York area, or in New England, Hurricane Andrew, right? Like hurricanes come up rather frequently, but they're not the only thing. Tornadoes might be associated in more rural areas. In California, there's earthquakes and wildfires. And we looked for these outliers in SHELDAS, what's called the Spatial Hazard Events and Losses Database for the US. In this way, we could find these outliers where there was large population declines and then verify that they're associated with an environmental event. we found 4 such events. And these are because of tornadoes or associated with tornadoes and winter weather and tropical cyclones and hailstorms and flooding and so on. And from this pool of 48 events, we built a displacement model. The idea was to move beyond just like looking at only Hurricane Katrina or only Hurricane Sandy when trying to think about how people move. Maybe people move differently when there's a smaller hurricane and so on. So we looked for these very large outliers. We looked for per capita losses and we found 48 environmental events. And then we made a very simple model, and I'm going to skip the equation for this and just go right to the punchline, which is how well does the model perform? So if we build this model, which uses a single input, which is the percentage of the population that we would expect to be displaced, and then we were to try and recreate what the population is using our model coefficients, we end up with very good model fit for the total population. This is very, very good performance. And if we disaggregate this to the individual age groups, we still have very good performance. That solid line would be a perfect score for everything. Everything is right on y equals x. So I think this is very encouraging for being able to translate a broad array of environmental hazards into some kind of a displacement model that we can then plug into a demographic model. It's great because it's very heterogeneous across multiple populations. Some of these are very small populations, some of them are very large, and we're not looking at any one period. We end up with multiple time periods as well. So then all we really need to plug this into a demographic model is just the percentage of the population that we would expect to migrate. It turns out this is, for sea level rise at least, this is relatively simple. If you think about 10% of an area going underwater, we could assume that maybe 10% of the people might migrate, which allows us to plug back into our displacement model. We then build a demographic model that's relatively simple. These are the only equations you'll see, I promise. And we're using a very niche demographic technique called a multi-regional Leslie matrix to do this, but essentially it only has 3 matrices. It has a population matrix that contains the population information. It has a migration matrix, M, that contains the probability of migrating from any county to any other county. And it has a survival matrix that contains mortality and fertility information. And so when we multiply these 3 together, we generate 3 different types of projections, which I'll show you in a second. One is a base level. So how I would project a population if I didn't think that climate change was happening, or I had no idea it was happening, right? This would be a climate agnostic model. We have a displacement model, which is just moving people across space. It's not demographically integrated. The term I like to think about it is that the migrants are demographically inert. They don't actually have kids in the future and so on. They're just sort of added in. And finally is the amplification projection. And this is where we actually get the amplified demographic effect. The migrants, they age, they have children, they move out, other people can move in and so on. So if we look at the effects between these 3 models and the differences, this would be for all coastal counties in the US that would be affected by sea level rise. And so the black line is our baseline projection. That's the climate agnostic projection. The blue line is our displacement one. This is how many people just simply move, right? These are the inert migrants in a sense. And then finally, we have that red line, the amplification. And if you take the base number in 2100 and subtract the displacement number, we get 1.4 million migrants in our median scenario. So this is what we're looking at right here is about 2 feet of sea level rise. So it's a very small amount of sea level rise. And it generates 1.4 million people moving across space. But when you put it inside the amplification, this becomes much more significant. We're looking at about 36 million people that would actually be moving across space, or at least the descendants of people, right? So we end up with this demographic amplification. It's considerably larger. It's about 26 times the effect of just movement. So if you think about it, if you have 10 people moving into an area and they all have children, and you get this sort of almost like a gravity effect, you end up with more people moving in over time. And then I want to show 3 different types within here. This is Anna Morandi and Kelly Main published this really great paper on the different typologies for climate migration, and I kind of borrowed from it because I really enjoyed it a lot. These would be, I'm going to show examples for vulnerable areas, receiving areas, and then climate destinations as well, or climate havens. So here's two heavily impacted areas. These are for Miami-Dade and for Dare County, North Carolina. Dare is in Outer Banks County. And so again, this is only 2 feet of sea level rise. You can see that the blue line and the black line are very similar to one another, yet it doesn't take a whole lot of climate migration to have a very large demographic amplification effect. In the case of Dare, the county almost bottoms out by the 2080s as people continue to move out. This would be for climate destinations. This is for McIntosh, Georgia, which is a very rural area on the Georgia coastline, and New York City, where Manhattan is. And we get this really interesting nonlinear effect with the populations, where McIntosh is initially a destination, but becomes a vulnerable county over time as it's exposed to sea level rise. In the case of New York, it's actually, the red line is actually below the black and the blue lines until about 2080, and then you can see it start to pick up, where New York might become a climate destination towards the end of the century. This is the kind of thing that you don't really get in some of the other modeling effects that I think are really important, is when climate migration is likely to occur as well. And then we also get these climate havens that can start popping out. I picked 3 here that I really like. And again, the amplification here is much larger than just simple displacement. In the case, Rutherford is just outside of Nashville, Douglas is just outside of Denver, and Washington, Oregon is just outside of Portland. In the case of Rutherford, you're looking at about 13,000 migrants, which translates into an amplification effect of about 250,000 people. So you can see how much larger that demographic amplification is versus just simple migrants. So if you were planning for climate migration into the future and you only planned for that 13,000 number of people, you'd be grossly underestimating the number of people you should actually plan and account for. This just shows the geography of it all. So we end up with quite a bit of destinations that pop out across the US. We see a lot of red as well on the coastlines, but not every coastline sees out migration. You can see California still has a number of areas that are coastal, but still see in migration to them. And if you look at New York State, you can see that many of the major cities still are receiver communities, right? They're likely to get people. Now, this is just for total. I've been focusing here just on total. But again, you know, migration propensity follows the clear age structure. And so could the combination of sea level rise and population aging lead to demographically stuck people? And it turns out that very much could be the case. Here you're looking at a scatter plot between the change in the median age between the baseline population projection and the amplification, and the change that you would expect because of sea level rise. So the more an area is affected, that negative 100%, these are areas that are really heavily impacted by sea level rise. They tend to get older because of sea level rise than we would expect. And on the flip side, areas that see a lot of growth because of migration tend to become younger as well over time. And remember, right, the oldest ages are those that are the least likely to migrate. And in particular for this kind of work, they're also the least likely to respond with environmental migration. So we could see this as well. It could amplify population aging in certain areas. And then as it relates, we could also standardize the age structure and then compare them. So it's a lot of words on this slide, but basically, if I were to project in a climate agnostic projection that 10% of a population would be over the age of 75, and if I were to have this fully integrated amplification projection and see 12%, then instead of 10%, we have 12% over 75, we'd say we have an overabundance of people. And we're calling this demographically stuck as opposed to demographically trapped. Trapped populations are garnering a lot of attention in the literature, but we're trying to move away from that because we don't really know the migration intentions of these individuals, or we really can't because most of them are in the future. So this is how the demographically stuck population changes over time to the end of the century for both men and women. So by the end of the century, we're looking at about 600,000 or so people that could be demographically stuck, meaning we have more people than we would expect in coastal areas over the age of 75 when we factor in climate migration. So it's not just a matter of who leaves and but also who stays behind. And we have a slight gender imbalance. There's slightly more women than there are men for this population. Here's some New York specific results and how these integrate together get really interesting. If I were to look at just the displacement model, which is just moving people around space, New York would see an increase of about 24,000 people. And with the amplification, it ends up being negative, actually, negative 13,000. So climate migration in this case would actually lead to a lower population in New York. Now, 13,000 on the 20 million people in New York is fairly small. But we do see some areas that have major changes. You can see that New York is about 100,000 people larger, and you can see that Nassau is about 100,000 people less. So some areas would be gaining population and others might be losing it. I think the only one here that I thought was interesting, I want to say was Ulster, which is where it's either Ulster or Westchester where Poughkeepsie is. And it's because it's affected by riverine flooding. The other thing is the demographically stuck population for New York. This would be about 25,000 people who could be demographically stuck in New York, meaning that we'd have more people than we would expect given just general demographic change. And I think that this is a rather significant number, even on a population the size of New York, simply because this is a very vulnerable population as well. So the amplification of demographic change is much larger than just the migration effect. We call this population amplification. And it's kind of like in demography, we have population, momentum, and gravity effects. And it's kind of like both of those, but not exactly like both of those. So we call it an amplification effect. I think that population aging in these vulnerable communities is important. And we don't really get to see this without a demographic model. And the notion of being demographically stuck has received virtually no attention in the climate migration discussion. But I think it's very important for heavily impacted areas. So it's not just the population itself that's aging, but also you have who's supporting those older individuals too, and then of course who's left behind, right? It tends to be older populations and mostly women. So this is where we started with, and it's been a large focus on sea level rise. And so there's lots of other climate impacts out there. It's not just tropical cyclones and sea level rise. There's also extreme heat and extreme precipitation and so on. And so we've started to put the pieces in place to plug this model right here in with another climate hazard, which would be extreme heat and cold. We started to do the modeling process so we could have both, not just sea level rise or not just extreme heat, but also sea level rise and extreme heat and cold as well. And this was a project that we started with GLISA, that we partnered with GLISA, and I'm going to let Kim take over real quick. Just tell me when to click, Kim, and hopefully you can jump on.
Yep. Thanks, Matt. So again, I'm Kim Chanel with the Great Lakes Integrated Sciences and Assessments, or GLISA team. And we're just shifting gears slightly here. I'm just jumping in briefly to explain GLISA's role in this arena and the collaboration that we've had with Matt and ASAP. So the background to this is that GLISA runs a small grants competition every few years to fund boundary spanning organizations to do climate adaptation related work. And in recent years, we've heard a lot of a peak in interest in the topic of climate driven migration to the Great Lakes from different stakeholders and practitioners, particularly though from our municipal partners in cities throughout the region who want to know what this means for them and for their planning. So when Matt and ASAP submitted a small grant application to pursue research on climate-driven migration to the Great Lakes, there was absolutely no hesitation for GLISA to fund it and to partner with them. As you can tell from this presentation so far, Matt already does such great work on migration. We just could not pass up an opportunity to get his expertise on Great Lakes specific analysis and have ASAP on board to facilitate this kind of merging of demography and climatology fields for this effort. So this Matt, ASAP, GLISA collaborative project set out to achieve a number of goals that are laid out here. And Rachel touched on a few of these things at the beginning of this workshop. But the first is to serve as a sort of springboard that can get the conversation started and catalyze other investments into research and action on this topic. And this workshop that you're attending is actually a great example of that goal already in action. The GLISA project funds were matched by NYSERDA to allow this larger project to happen and bring together other great migration teams that you'll be hearing from later today so that the teams can learn from one another. And the second goal was to introduce a new narrative around climate change that focuses on potential benefits and opportunities rather than just negative impacts and risks, because there is a unique opportunity to address where certain climate sensitive industries are falling behind and could be more vulnerable to population growth, and then to position Great Lakes communities and businesses for a future of economic success. So this project set out to give leaders from businesses and municipal and state governments a better idea of how climate change is already influencing climate sensitive industries and encourage them to be prepared to work together in order to ensure that the Great Lakes can be poised for sustainable and just growth into the next century. So we hope that this project can be a starting point to work towards those ultimate goals. So that's the why behind this project, but if Matt can click to the next slide, I'll talk you through the how. So what was actually done or still being done to achieve those goals. And the main idea was to produce a relatively simple and replicable methodology for understanding climate migration that could then be adopted by states or communities who want a better idea of what to expect when it comes to climate-driven migration, and then to potentially integrate that information into operational planning or management decisions. And to do this, we started with a historical analysis of the relationship between migration into the Great Lakes from places outside of the region and the role that different climate indicators might play, in this case, starting with temperature. So Matt had created a migration model that he can plug in observational climate data to and see what it tells us. And then BJ Bali provided climate level, county level climate observations for an array of different variables. So things like average temperature, high and low temperature, extremes, days over 95, days below 32, and so on, to plug into Matt's model and just see what we could get, see what it tells us. And BJ's on the webinar today and will be part of the Q&A if anyone has specific questions about the data that was used. So that is where we are so far, but this is still an ongoing project. So I'm going to hand it back to Matt to explain where we're going next and what we've already seen from some preliminary results.
Sure, thank you, Kim. So to do this historical analysis, we used two different data sets. The first was the IRS county to county migration data. And this covers about 87% of US households, which are the vast majority of the tax filing universe and their dependents. So essentially, if you filed your taxes in one location in 1 year and the next year you filed them in a different location, you would be considered a migrant in this data. And then we also used a downscaled set of historical temperature data covering the same period. And we started with the average annual daily minimum and maximum temperatures for all of the counties. And eventually we moved to the number of days at different hot and cold temperature thresholds. So these were the two primary data sets that we had. And then we built just a really simple gravity model where the number of migrants between counties is a function of the distance between the counties, right? So further distance being lower amounts of migrants, population size, so more people are likely to move to larger populations, and then the differences in the temperatures between counties. So as an example, with delta T, the differences in temperatures, if you have a temperature of 25 in the origin and 25 at the destination, that would be delta 3. And so our sample is about 122,000 county year pairs. So moving from Cook County to Suffolk County in 1999, that would be one sample year, one county year in the data. And then, so with this, we could look at a model. It's a very, very simple one. I'm just going to show the very initial results. This tells us the number of additional migrants we would expect to see per something like 100,000 people. And at the same time, the difference then gives us that percentage increase or decrease in the number of people. So what we found is a statistically significant positive relationship between the temperature differentials and the number of migrants moving into the Great Lakes region. So as temperature increases, the number of migrants also tends to increase. So who's moving into the Great Lakes region? They tend to come from colder areas than than their destination. So you could be coming from upstate New York or upstate Minnesota to Chicago, and that would be a cooler example, right? You're moving from a colder area to a warmer area in the Great Lakes region. Because our N is so large, we end up with a very large significance. If we looked at out-migration, we found a significant negative relationship between temperature differentials, right? So as temperature increased, the number of migrants tended to decrease. So migrants out of the Great Lakes region also tended to go to colder areas as well, which we thought was very interesting. This was not the relationship that I expected to see, nor what you usually see in sort of the idea that people are moving, very south and so on. It might be that people are moving westward to other parts of the U.S. that might be colder than where they're originating from. So this is great because it's very easy to implement into the migration model. The differences between the expected migrants and the hot or cold migrants gives us the needed displacement. And I think too that this introduces new narratives around climate change, around benefits and opportunities rather than negative impacts and risks, right? The nice thing about focusing nationally is that something that might happen in another part of the country, like a very extreme cold snap in Texas, has implications for the Great Lakes regions as well. And then I also think it puts bounds on likely futures that are coming forward, right? As opposed to just speculating, sort of wild speculation about what's likely to happen in the future and what to plan for. Thank you.
Great. So thank you so much. Sorry, Matt and Kimberly, terrific presentations and great work. Also BJ in the background. So there's been a very active set of questions on Slido. If you've put your questions in the chat and not in the Slido, I may not be able to get to them. I've kind of grouped some together, and I think, first, I just thought it might be worth clarifying a few points that came up in some of the Slido questions. Some people had a little difficulty with the idea of augmenting the model or augmented model. My understanding, and I'll paraphrase so that maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that basically because migration tends to happen disproportionately in the younger age groups, as impacts occur in counties that are coastal, those younger people will tend to move somewhere else, often inland. And when they move, they also form families, they have children, etc. And what's left in the coastal counties tends to be a demographically older population. And that's the group that you called not trapped, but demographically stuck in place. Okay. So that may explain for some people. I'm sure some of these questions came early in the presentation, so some people may have actually figured that out by the time you finish, but I just thought I'd clarify. Was that a correct summary, more or less?
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely.
Great. I did paste a few questions from the Slido into, and so there were also some questions about, well, can we really assume that people are going to have children at the same rates as they have in the past? Did you make any assumptions about that? Also, to say from a methodological point of view, I was interested in the confidence intervals you had, because your R squared was so high that I would have thought you'd have this like narrow band around each of these projections, and instead they're often very broad. So if you could speak a little bit to those questions about how do you make assumptions about family formation and childbearing in the future?
Yeah. So fertility is trended in the model. So whatever has been occurring over the last 40 years in terms of fertility rates, that is forecasted forward in a time series model. So if an area is experiencing well, the US as a whole is seeing lower fertility rates. So those are sort of carried forward into the future. So one of the things that can happen is that people could move from a lower fertility area to a higher fertility area. And one of the things this model does is assumes that you'll be exposed to the probability of having kids at the same rate in your destination as opposed to in your origin, which might or might not be the case. But fertility has trended, it's almost universally trending downward to lower fertility rates.
Great.
The second one you had was about the confidence intervals. So yes, the model coefficients are very tight, but the other components of the demographic projection are not as tight. And those relate to the fertility has a large amount of uncertainty. The underlying survival matrix has a lot of uncertainty in it as well. And so that's where almost all the model uncertainty is. And that's borne out on that just very wide confidence intervals.
Excellent. There was another question about the demographic composition. So Matt, I know you produced in the past county level projections. I'm going to actually put a link to those data if people want to look at them. We took Matt's original data and made it into, I guess, it wasn't wide format rather than long format, which was your original format, and also linked it to shape files for people who want to do mapping and things. But there's a really good question about racial composition and whether some of these, there'd be a racial differential in how people might move out of, say, the Gullah Geechee region or Miami-Dade or things like that. Can you say anything about that?
Yeah, so in my original projections, the county level that would be sort of thought about as being climate agnostic, those do have race information in them, race ethnicity information, but they're not linked up to this kind of migration modeling. And so with the IRS data doesn't have race data in it is one of the big limitations. And so county to county migration by race is kind of hard to get to. I guess on a macro level, I could assume that all race groups experience the same county level migration patterns, which might or might not be true. But that's one of the areas I want to move, I'm hoping to move into the future, is to not just look at age and sex, but also age, sex, and race as well. I'm just not quite there yet.
Okay, terrific. I think that's a great direction. So then there's a bunch of questions that had to do with how could we apply this to other climate issues or climate things that occur? What about multiple events, layered events? What about drought? What about fires? What about smoke and, hazardous air quality? So I'm curious what you're thinking about in terms of, you've got this incredible treasure trove of data now, both sets of data really, the IRS and the other data that you compiled. Are you actually planning to look at some of those types of questions? I know you looked at temperature already as well, so.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the really cool things about this approach is that it boils down to just one variable. It's like, it's super parsimonious. And that's just what's the percentage of the population that you would expect to move? And so you can do it with just simple, like, what if scenarios, like, what if a Category 5 hurricane slams into New York and it loses 10% of its population? What would that do for New York State? That can be done in this type of a modeling framework. Or you can actually have modeled output as well, like I'm trying to get to with the heat and cold data as well, where we can then plug that in for every place in the US and how it would change migration patterns. So it's not just limited to sea level rise. I think this kind of a modeling framework has a lot of broad applicability. This is like just the beginning part of it.
Yeah, I know. I anticipate 10 to 15 more peer-reviewed journal articles coming out of this. So excellent. So Kim and BJ, I want to bring you in on the conversation a little bit since you're from the Great Lakes. Matt, sorry, you're from a coastal county in the South, but maybe you'll end up in the Great Lakes region one day. I know you probably want to get up there, but what are some of the what are some of the issues in terms of these haven counties, in terms of what are we going to see likely in terms of, is the movement more going to be to the urban dense areas around the Great Lakes? We know that the Great Lakes has seen a decline historically because of the economic downturn and the quote unquote rest belt. What are some of the things that, I gave a talk years ago in Flint, not that long ago, pre-COVID, seems like years ago, and they were saying, boy, maybe we could be a receiving area. Some of the students were starting to think along those lines, and I thought, yeah, you're not too far from the truth. There's people thinking about this already. So what do you all see as being major attributes beyond being removed from hurricanes and things like that, that might induce people to move to your region? Again, Kim and BJ, if you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think the first part of your question about specifically what areas are they moving to is still more of a Matt question. And then even the second part of that question about what encourages people to move here is not really something we're experts on, but it is generally a climate winner is how it's been presented a lot. I know cities like Duluth especially get that label a lot, because even though we are experiencing things like increases in extreme precipitation or severe storms that can still cause a lot of damage and extreme heat and things like that, it's comparatively to other regions of the US, not nearly as bad. So we don't get hurricanes, we don't get wildfires typically. Our drought is typically a lot less severe and less damaging, at least in the Great Lakes Basin, maybe more in the plains part of the Midwest. That's not always the case, but that is typically, and not to mention the abundance of fresh water that we have, that is pretty unique to this region. That is one of our big climate winner aspects of the Great Lakes. Yeah, I don't know,
Great.
PJ, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I was going to stress that last point, actually. I think one of the big things is a relatively moderate climate for an inland location, and it's moderated by the lakes specifically. Our summers, winters, those even things out a little bit more than if you go west across the lakes, where it's much more continental. But yeah, it really does come down to fresh water in my mind. We happen to have a lot of it, and right now it's legally protected that a lot of it can't be exported, but that remains to be seen if that holds up in the future. And that is an area of concern too. You hear people talking about ever since I've been in the region, which is about since 2014. So coming up on a decade, that's been part of the discussion.
So there's some questions about the dyads. Also, Matt, it wasn't clear to me whether your in and out migration in the Great Lakes included people who might have started in the Great Lakes region and ended up. You mentioned northern Minnesota moving to somewhere else, and so they got marginally warmer, I think it was, when they moved. And then people were actually moving out to colder places, which seemed, again, a little bit odd, as you mentioned. Where does your set of pairs also include internal migration within the region?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, no, it's only out of the Great Lakes. So I did have a model specification where people were moving in and in, but this was mainly out to in and then in to out.
Okay.
So maybe not quite northern Minnesota to Chicago, but maybe North Dakota to Chicago, or Maine to Chicago, that kind of thing.
So Matt, how would you frame some of this work vis-a-vis like the work that Jesse Keenan and others have done related to Duluth being potentially a big migration area, and New York Times articles and things. Someone else mentioned that there are a lot of people moving out of Scottsdale into northern Wisconsin. Is this something, a lot of anecdotal stuff, but how do you balance what you're doing with that kind of anecdotal work, and how do you see the two interweaving with one another?
Yeah, I can completely see that as being very feasible when you look at the temperature and wildfire data, much more so than if you look at something like sea level rise or tropical cyclones. And part of that has to do with the distance between, like, southern Louisiana and northern Wisconsin. And part of it has to do with just the magnitude of the impact. Like, people love to point to tropical cyclones. It's like a great, good example of sending people out of areas as a migration center event. But, the real area of effect of a hurricane is relatively small at the end of the day. If you look at the heat dome effect earlier this year, I mean, there was 10 times as many people that were under the heat dome in the Pacific Northwest than will be affected by sea level rise. So you get a much broader pool of which migrants can be drawn from, as opposed to just, something like sea level rise or a hurricane.
One might say that, I was having a conversation, our breakout, with someone who's in the Berkshires. I'm in Manhattan. As heat levels rise over the course of this century, COVID may be one thing. People are leaving the city because they're finding these, the heat and intensity and other things of being in the city to be too much. And so they're looking for places outside the city. And so I think some of those things, just, as a side comment, may, things that we don't anticipate will upend the apple cart in ways that we're not fully aware. But this is really excellent starting point. I think we're running out of time. There are more questions, but in the interest of time, I think we should probably end here, and I'll turn it back over to Beth and team. And thank you so much, our panelists. Really excellent work and very, very illuminating. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alex, for moderation of that Q&A. Thank you, Matt, BJ, and Kim, for the work on this methodology. I think it's fascinating. As you all know, I have admired the work that you all do for a long, long time, and getting to hear this latest update has been an awesome opportunity. We are going to go into a break next. I did want to mention, Matt, I'm pretty sure this is accurate. Some folks from Buffalo had asked me about whether or not your projections will tell us anything about Buffalo Bill's victory. And I thought that might be something we could run as a post-credit presentation. So just stay on for that if you're interested. But for now, we're going to go to a 5-minute break. We want to give everybody a chance to get up, stretch your legs, get your coffee. When we come back at 1:25 or 25 after, whatever hour it is where you are, we're going to be hearing about neighborhood livability and housing access for climate migrants across New York State. So I encourage you to stay in the meeting, turn off your camera, turn off your microphone. We'll be back at 1:25 for our next section. Thank you so much for our first presentations today. Looking forward to the next set of discussions. So our next section is from Methodology Team 2. And our overarching topic that we're going to be hearing about is livability and housing access for climate migrants across New York State. This is going to begin with a presentation on COVID-induced migration and potential climate destinations in New York State from Isaac Gendler and Ross Platel. So I'm going to introduce Isaac and Ross, and then after their presentation, I'll be presenting or introducing our next two speakers, Kelly Leilani Main and Osamu Kumasaka, for the background on them before they give their presentation. So first up, Isaac Gendler is a utilities engineer with the California Public Utility Commission, and is one of my kind of favorite superhero bios of anyone who I ever get to read. Isaac works by day as a utilities engineer and by night as a housing policy climate adaptation researcher. The interest in climate migration was spurred by witnessing the effects of the 2018 Paradise Fire while living in the San Francisco Bay Area. Isaac has served as the lead quantitative analyst for the post-COVID pull factor methodologies project. And Ross Platel is an urban technology researcher at the University of Calgary and the Southern Alberta Institute of Technology. Ross is an urban civic technologist with a future-minded focus. He works with the University of Calgary as part of the academic research and discussion group on smart cities, while also acting as support for virtually delivered courses. His research on the impacts of climate-induced human migration has been inspired by his passion for the environment in connection with nature, along with his desire to improve the lived human experience. You can learn more about both of our speakers by looking at the extended bios available to you in the participant resources. And so, handing over to Ross and Isaac.
Yeah, thank you for the great introduction there, Beth. Just get my slides up here.
That looks good.
Thank you. Yeah, so welcome everybody. Thanks for those of you who are on the call today. Isaac and my project here is on the COVID pull factor analysis and the impacts on climate migration. Isaac, do you want to say hello there?
Hello.
Just a little bit of background on our project. We came together earlier this year looking at the following questions, talking about people in New York State and how they'll have to move with the advent of climate change, looking at where they'll go, how those receiving communities will be selected, and how they'll have to change to accommodate those new climate migrants. Our focus has been on the COVID impacts on climate migration. So COVID has acted as a shock to human migration flows, changing where people look to move and the decisions that they make. Our project aims to take the lessons from COVID, analyze those shocks in the migration patterns, map the significant migration flows to cities and towns, analyze the trends toward increasing population, focusing on the towns and regions that are low climate risk, and then analyzing their social and economic factors, and showcasing for you today the receiver regions for migration.
So our methodology was inspired by the excellent work of Kelly Leilani Main and Anne Mirandi on their research paper titled Vulnerable City, Recipient City, or Climate Destination towards the typology of domestic climate migration impacts in U.S. cities. Our goal? To analyze and anticipate which regions are going to become receiving communities through data-driven analysis. We wanted to do this using zip code data from the USPS because of its granularity. We also wanted to analyze the current socioeconomic conditions and climate risk of the towns and cities and regions we'll be looking at. We also wanted to illustrate what appears to be working for them, and then consider how can they further adapt and become welcoming for migrants. So each town has been analyzed for its ready access to the following climate destination factors, which were selected by Kelly's and Anna's aforementioned paper. Specifically, we looked at access to fresh water, high vacancy rates or abundance of affordable housing, amount of infrastructure to support more residents, an expressed desire to grow and be welcoming, and a history of or interest in improving adaptive capacity through sustainability and/or resilience efforts. For our method, we assessed zip code changes over the past 3 years as an analog for population movement. That being 2019, 2020, and August 8th, 2021. Our last year only went up to August 8th because that's when we downloaded the data. So, and because this data is pretty much generated on like a daily basis, we only have the data up until then. And so it's going to be a little bit smaller and less intense than the data that went up to December 31st, 2019 and 2020. However, we use this to process the differences between the end of 2020 and end of 2019 and August 8th, 2021 and December 31st, 2020 for population movements. Afterwards, we quantified the city's climate vulnerability using climatecheck.com, giving us the following environmental risk scores in order of importance: flood, storm, heat, drought, and fire. We use this to analyze climate destination factors for chosen urban centers and compare chosen cities to look for commonalities with pull factors for migration.
On this slide, we have the climate safe receiving towns, and we've broken it down into regions. So within the New York and Hudson Valley region, we looked at Carmel, Scarsdale, Hartsdale, Woodstock, New City, Rhinebeck, and Hudson. In the Buffalo region, we looked at Hamburg, East Aurora, and West Sedna. And some of the other regions included the Albany region, where Saratoga Springs is, and in the Rochester region, we looked at Pittsford.
All cities became increasing in population starting in 2020. Half the towns actually flipped from losing population to gaining population. And even though most of the 2020 population change rates look smaller, as I mentioned before, take this with a grain of salt. This is only up until August 8th, 2021. So given that it's only the first 2/3 of the year, it's probably going to be larger once this year is over.
So the cities that we broke down using the work of Kelly Lilani and Anna Morandi's paper, they broke down into 3 categories. Type 1 is vulnerable cities. Those will be labeled in red there. They are cities or towns that are at risk for climate disasters. Type 2 are the recipient cities. These are cities and towns that are receiving migrants and under pressure due to the migration. And for this case study, we also classified cities that have a higher future climate risk in this category. And then finally, we have the climate destinations, which will be labeled in green. Those are the cities and towns that have a potential to accept more migrants and adapt. Here's what that looks like when they're broken down. So we've got the main vulnerable cities in each of the regions. So that's New York, Buffalo, and Rochester. Recipient cities right now that have a high climate risk and are seeing a lot of people are Scarsdale, West Sedna, Woodstock, and Rhinebeck. And then the climate destinations being Hudson, Hamburg, Hartsdale, East Aurora, Carmel, Saratoga Springs, Pittsford, and New City. And here you can see those mapped just within New York State there. So we've got the Buffalo region here, Rochester region here, Albany region up here, and then the Hudson Valley and New York City region down here. Within Buffalo, looking at the towns, all the towns that we selected that had the high inward migration and low climate risk are towns that had apps and websites, and that allowed easy access for town services through that central website or app. West Edna was gaining population, and it has the close proximity to Buffalo because of related amenities, and it has easier transit access, but it lacks elements of walkability as well as diversity in the population. Hamburg and East Aurora are both seeing increased population, and they have some of the highest walkability and bikeability scores in the region. They have a lot of sidewalks along quiet streets, and when we looked at their walk score, you can walk it to all of the main amenities, usually within about 20 to 30 minutes. Isaac, you're just on mute there.
Buffalo, the main city, was classified as a vulnerable city due to the fact that it is right on Lake Erie. West Seneca, being somewhat more further inland, is classified as a recipient city, even though it has a much lower flood risk score than Buffalo. It still is pretty vulnerable and prone to flooding, which is why it's not a complete climate destination like Hamburg and East Aurora, which are quite inland and much, much more safe. East Aurora has been consistently increasing in population since 2019. West Seneca flipped its population growth during COVID. It used to be losing population, but now it's growing. And Hamburg is probably one of the most interesting graphs we have here. As you can see, it was losing population at quite a big rate in 2019, but in 2020, it starts moving forward, and population gains to skyrocket in 2021. In fact, Hamburg is the only city we've listed where the 2021 data suggests that the zip code changes are actually higher than 2020, despite the fact that the year is not even over yet when we took the data. So that says something. I think we should definitely be keeping our eyes on this town.
Moving on to the New York and the Hudson Valley region, we found that people are locating in and around the rail access, just giving them easy access throughout the region, as well as with the amenities down in New York City. People are locating in and around existing resources and services, usually towns and regions that have high-end shopping and amenities, as well as arts and culture interests. Surrounding towns and cities around major centers are also seeing increased migration flow. So the towns in and around Hudson, for example, are starting to see an overflow of people, as some people are even being pushed out of Hudson. There's potential there for densification. Variety of design and the makeup of receiving towns we're seeing. So they're catering to specific demographics, industries, and lifestyle. And all of the towns have this historically preserved look and feel, which seems to be attracting people there as well.
So New York City, even though it has very low flood risk score, because it's right on the coastline, has lots of dense regions there, we decided from a qualitative perspective that it will be a vulnerable city. And you can even see this in Matt Howard's presentation, where at least until 2080, it's going to be probably losing population due to climate migration. Scarsdale, Woodstock, and Rhinebeck, being further inland, were designed to be recipient cities. However, they're not as safe as Carmel, Hartsdale, New City, and Hudson, because those cities have a pretty negligible flood risk score. All towns have started increasing population with the advent of COVID, and Hudson, Hartsdale, and Saratoga Springs reversed from losing population to gaining population. So it's pretty good.
So just looking at the other regions there, Isaac mentioned Saratoga Springs. We put that in the Albany region just because that is further inland, but it does kind of extend up north from Hudson there. And then we looked at Pittsford and the Rochester region. Interestingly enough, both these towns have had a similar spike in population after COVID, reversing their trends of losing population from before. And all other surrounding towns and cities in their regions have been losing population. Both have had projects in recent years that have focused on enhancing public spaces and amenities in areas such as urban renewal, walkability, downtown Main Street investment, local community initiatives, and ecological and sustainable investments. Within Pittsford, it has the close proximity to Rochester for more amenities within driving distance, and in recent years, it has had a focus on walkability and bikeability. Historically, it's been predominantly car-oriented, but that's been changing in the core. They have a focus on nature parks and pathways that connect those amenities and the communities themselves, although the walks tend to be longer to those amenities from the outlying areas just because of the predominantly car-oriented previous designs. There is potential, though, for densification already due to the traffic calming and walkability combined with seating in the downtown core and along the pathways throughout the town. And on the outskirts of the town, the home builders tend to focus on amenities and stay in larger homes, designing homes for longer periods of living at home, which has been appealing to those remote working employees who want to have multiple offices in the home for both parents, for example, working while still having kids within the home.
Being further inland, Pittsford has a much lower climate risk score than Rochester. Rochester, like Buffalo, is right on the lake, so it's going to have some flooding issues. However, Pittsburgh does have a higher fire risk than most cities and towns we've researched. This leads to the possible need for improvement in fire safety design and services. And we also have to talk about how the outlying communities and sprawl have winding roads that can harm emergency access. This, being from California, I know that this was a big factor in why so many people perished during the 2018 Paradise Fire, where there's a lot of single occupant lanes for vehicles that were winding in a mountainous ledge and were surrounded by fires, and people just passed away because it was too suburbanized. And that there needs to be focus more on densification with more varied living options that could really be useful in attracting more migrants.
And then just moving on to the last town we looked at here, which is probably the gem of the bunch, is Saratoga Springs, north of Albany. It has been the outlier in the region gaining population during COVID, where it was losing population in the years prior. Their focus on renewable energy and resilience strategies appear to be influencing the decisions on people to locate there. And this is showcasing the positive impacts of initiatives such as Solar for All and other ones that have been done by NYSERDA and the city. This, combined with other aspects such as digital services, the existing walkable core, a focus on urban forestry, and efforts toward zero waste, are all making compound impacts that are seemingly attracting those migrants.
Unlike other regions, Saratoga Springs does not have a significantly lower climate risk than its largest neighbor in the region. Albany is pretty inland, so it's pretty safe. And this shows the potential for similar policy implementations or practices in the Albany region to continue the trends from Saratoga Springs. You know, if Albany plays its cards right, it too can be a climate receiving community.
And just looking at what we learned from the project after working on it over the past year, we've seen that there's been a myriad of factors that influence people's decisions to move, but few consider the long-term environmental impacts when moving. People's decisions to move are not solely based on the climate risk. We specifically looked at the climate vulnerability to each city to determine possible climate havens, as some of the largest receiver regions were extremely high climate risk. Access to data sets and high-level detail have been delayed or inaccessible. There's been a lot of data and communications that we haven't been able to get to during COVID. So we had to work with the data sets that were available, adapting our methodology and methods to work within that limited data, as well as planning for the possibilities of future data while working on the project that we had in queue, regardless on whether we were going to be able to get it in time or not.
Future work we really want to look into is the multitude. First of all, we want to look at construction development stats over recent years. Do these towns that were already have construction momentum, or do we need to get started? Because with more people means more need for homes, which means more construction. If it doesn't have construction momentum, it's going to have a lot of difficulty. We also, very importantly, need to assess how open these towns will be to BIPOC communities. Not every place is truly a destination just based off climate. That if these towns are not accepting of people of color, BIPOC folks, then it's not really a community that's going to be welcoming, and that we really have to think about where should we place people, because we want to make sure that they're safe. We also need to look at more detailed stats on transit, especially in the Hudson Valley region, because it's strongly connected by train to NYC and will play a factor in the development of the towns. We're also interested in looking at if we're going to have detailed discussions with leaders in these cities and towns. We have to understand their policy decisions and the scope of their understanding of climate impacts, both direct and of climate migrational impacts. Some future data sets that we are thinking about incorporating in the coming time is that we're looking at new Census Bureau stats that will be available. A lot of times, Census Bureau stats lag behind by 2 years. That's why we were only able to get official population estimates for 2019 this year. And so with more official stats, the better data we can get. And we were able to see what's the true impact of migration during COVID. We can look at census racial breakdowns to understand the diversity of each town. If a town is more diverse, there's a better chance it's going to be accepting of people from more diverse demographics. We also can look at migration from the IRS to understand more nuances and patterns. We can look at birth and death rates in various regions to understand changes. We can look into data on businesses and mode of work, focusing on long-term trends and impact of remote working on communities and resulting migrational impacts. We also can see about more detailed adaptive capacity indicators, as well as environmental, social culture, technological overviews of towns using detailed data from the specific towns and cities where available. Some planning for future migrations that this can really help with and we really need to look at. We need to integrate demographic modeling methods. We need to focus on the potential to create community partnerships along with realizing the potential migration channels that already exist. Some literature review we've we've done, we found that climate migration can occur within massive groups if a community leader says, okay, we have to move to this area. And if we can build those migration channels and pathways, we can really get a more sustainable long-term strategy going. We have to look into more welcoming and affordable towns with potential for receiving migrants that are more at risk and are low income. We have to do more interviews on why people move to specific regions and match the demographics to help anticipate and facilitate movement of migrants. And finally, we have to assess the effectiveness of zoning. We really need to have more housing, specifically dense housing. And that means rezoning, then that means rezoning. Thank you for your time. It was our pleasure speaking about this subject with you. If you want to contact us, our information is below, and we'll always be happy to get in touch.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And again, feel free to contact us if you have any recommendations or would like to work with us with what we mentioned at the end for future research.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ross and Isaac, for that presentation. And we are going to be going right into our next presentation, but I encourage you to continue using the same Slido link and going ahead and as you put questions in, make sure that you're noting that they're for Ross and Isaac. So to help me as a moderator, when we get into our moderated discussion with our two presentation teams, I can see right off there's questions about flood risk and how that's being interpreted. So I'm sure we're going to come back to that during our Q&A session. But for now, I am so pleased to have the opportunity to introduce our next presentation, Push, Pulled, or Stranded, Invisible Housing and Mobility in the Climate Migration Conversation. This presentation will be shared with us by Kelly Leilani Main, who is the Executive Director and co-founder of Buy-in Community Planning. Buy-in is an organization providing equitable and accessible relocation services for communities on the front lines of irreversible climate impacts. Kelly has worked as a planner, designer, and geospatial analyst at the intersection of climate adaptation planning and rights-driven relocation policy in contexts as diverse as the Philippines, Turkey, Ghana, Uganda, Peru, Nepal, Lebanon, Palestine, and the US. She is joined by Osamu Kumasaka, who is the Community Action Director with Buy-in. And Osamu is a planner and researcher who believes that though climate science has advanced greatly, governments struggle to engage vulnerable residents and provide resources that improve lives. His passion is for helping underrepresented peoples tell their stories of environmental and housing injustice. And again, you can learn more about both of these terrific speakers by looking at their full bios on our bio sheet. Kelly and Osamu, thank you so much for being here. I hand it over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kelly Leilani Main. Really happy to be here with Osamu Kumasaka, my co-founder of Buy-in Community Planning. And today we're going to be talking about invisible housing and immobility in the climate migration conversation. Before we dive into some of the work that we've been doing over the last 9 months or so with ASAP, just a brief overview. We are founders of a new organization that's really dedicated to creating collaborative and comprehensive approaches to assisted relocation. And so a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is directly related to the ongoing research and work that we're doing to ensure that households who are interested in relocating away from high vulnerability areas have the resources that they need. And with that, I'll turn it over to Osamu.
Thanks, Kelly. My name is Osamu. Again, I use he, him pronouns. And I just want to give a quick background on some of the things that we've learned over the last 9 months and a little bit of the context of our specific studies. So climate migration, can really range from mobility as a proactive and planned adaptation strategy to forced displacement in the face of life-threatening risks. And we looked into how climate migration can be a movement into, within, or out of a country or region, and decided to focus specifically on kind of short-range internal migration within New York State out of neighborhoods that experienced flooding. And we did so because we know that many climate migrants have been making and will want to make short range moves in the future to stay close to their friends and family and the places that they love. So within or close to the cities or counties where they currently live. And another thing we know about climate migration is that it's motivated by both push and pull factors. So by definition, the push factors of environmental shocks or stressors in sending areas, and then also the availability of jobs and housing amenities, the kind of kin networks that I was talking about in receiving areas relative to sending areas. So I think an interesting fact when we just think about this kind of short range geography is that in the New York region, most people live within 8 miles of their mother. So I think, mobility is really, I think it's much smaller in range for a lot of people than maybe we typically think about. Next slide, please. And we specifically studied how housing impacts mobility. And so I just wanted to set the stage by saying that housing security is really a foundation for health. Stable housing is key to individual and collective well-being. It's a key social determinant of health. And research indicates that severe environmental disasters have this disruptive effect on and create residential displacement. And this affects climate migrants' welfare. And in turn, climate migrants will affect local housing markets in these receiving cities that they move to. So there's some kind of notable examples here, which I'm happy to talk more about in the comments and questions section. Next slide, thanks. Another thing that we wanted to really center our research in is that moving requires resources. It's a really resource intensive process. And so climate migration as an adaptive response can either be mitigated or exacerbated by the financial assets that each household experiencing climate impacts has access to when they want to move into a new place. And beyond socioeconomic status, there's other factors like physical mobility constraints, like one's access to a car or physical disabilities, tolerance of risk and attachment to place and where one currently lives, as well as how close one feels with one's neighbors, that can all affect our ability or willingness to move to adapt to environmental hazards. Programs like floodplain buyouts can support migration by providing resources to fund and otherwise assist households moving out of harm's way. And so we'll talk a little bit more about these kinds of programs. Next slide, please. So the specific phenomena that we wanted to draw attention to is how, there's been a lot of attention paid to holdouts, this idea of people who refuse to move in the face of kind of the environmental hazards that they're experiencing, as well as to the harms associated with displacement. While displacement is a highly disruptive effect, we argue that displacement is not the only effect of housing insecurity, only perhaps the most visible effect. Flood-affected households often experience worsening financial status, health, and well-being impacts while they are supposedly rebuilding and recovering in place. And as flood hazards increase and the homes prone to flooding are discounted more deeply, we worry that homeowners may start to experience declining home values as a barrier to residential mobility. So, people's ability to sell their home might affect their ability to find a new place elsewhere. And when people want to move but are unable to, we call this state of being involuntary immobility or strandedness. And this is our main theoretical contribution with this project. Next slide, please. Some potential contributors, we think, to the state of being stranded might be deteriorating housing quality or housing price that is being discounted because it's known in the housing market that it's in a flood zone. Perhaps the poor declining health of people living in the house. So this might include disabilities that limit the housing that is appropriate for people to live in if they were to try to move. Economic burdens, including mounting debt from rebuilding or increasing flood insurance costs. Social and psychological barriers to leaving, including social pressure from one's community or family, or trauma, which people experience after events. And then also a lack of affordable replacement housing for people to move into. These all might contribute to a feeling of being stuck. Next slide, please. We know that flooding has had significant impacts on New York State's housing stock. I'll just highlight here because we zoomed in specifically on the Superstorm Sandy response and mobility following Sandy, that it flooded nearly 90,000 buildings, causing $19 billion in damage and left over 2 million people without power. And it was interesting because actually, when they looked at who had the greatest cost of rebuilding, perhaps counterintuitively, homeowners who have access to more wealth actually faced greater expenses than renters, and in a way were more tied in place to the assets that were damaged in Sandy. And so both the state and the city put together buyout programs to try to offer mobility as an adaptation response to some neighborhoods in these kind of designated enhanced buyout zones. And I think those programs have been much criticized, but we found that there's really a lot to learn from the way that they compensated people who are participating. And so our study specifically focuses on that as kind of a case study. And then we have some more recent examples as well of how hurricanes and other climate-driven disasters can damage people's health and also housing stocks. And there's these alarming predictions about how in the future, potentially over 4,000 units of affordable housing in New York City are estimated to be exposed to coastal flooding per year by 2050. So there's really a scale challenge here, and in the urgency of trying to figure out how we can create responses to this increasing exposure. Next slide, please. I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but here's some of the different ongoing planning and policy processes which might be a vehicle for thinking about climate migration. Next slide, please. Oh, there we go. So just to really set the stage for what Kelly's about to describe in terms of the geography of availability and what neighborhoods were available to buyout participants, we looked at the Governor's Office of Storm Recovery's post-Sandy buyout program. So this was a program where people could receive the pre-storm fair market value of their home, plus an additional incentive of up to 15% of that value for relocating within the same county that they currently lived in before the storm. And this was a program that was administered at the state level by the Governor's Office of Storm Recovery using federal funding that was made available after the disaster. And it also provided, the state provided matching funds for that federal funding. This was perhaps the most generous compensation and incentive package offered by any buyout program at that time, yet those incentives were found to not necessarily relieve the financial burden for buyout participants whose primary concern was their ability to secure appropriate, desirable, and equivalent new housing. Next slide, please. And so we think that this issue of strandedness will increasingly become an issue for both climate migrants undertaking moves on their own and for folks participating in buyout programs for a couple different reasons. But just to really simply illustrate this point, you can see here, if you had a home that was worth $60,000 a sending area and you received the pre-storm fair market value for that home, it might not, if that was your primary means of funding your relocation, it might not allow you to move into a comparable home that's valued at a greater amount outside of the receiving area, especially when you take into account discounts from flooding risk, the mortgage balance, and other debts held by the household, and flood insurance is another thing that's not listed here, but that might increasingly be a financial cost that prevents this kind of relocation. We're concerned about the presence of a rehousing cost gap that will either make mobility an impossibility or will severely restrict the housing options available to climate migrants, and especially those that are low income. The ability to sell one's house for a certain amount is critical in order to replace it with a comparable house nearby that meets one's needs in terms of affordability, size, and location. And the potential consequences of this might be that migrants must move into or continue living in substandard or dangerous housing located in the flood zone because they can't afford anything else. So I'll now turn it over to Kelly to talk about how we looked at this geography of housing mobility.
All right, thanks, Osamu. I'm going to fly through the rest of our presentation and we can talk about any other details during the Q&A session. So when we talk about housing mobility in general, we're talking about affordability, availability, and the adaptability of the existing housing stock. But to zoom out a little bit, normally when we think about vulnerabilities and we think about climate impacts, there's a lot of focus, which is really fantastic, on who is at risk. So for example, who are the low and middle income communities? Where are BIPOC or majority minority communities living, and what are the potential impacts? So here's just an overview of, if we just look at hurricane inundation zones in the New York area, what is the total number of parcels that we're talking about that's affected? And it's absolutely massive. If you can see here, we've got 500,000 parcels cumulative effect from hurricane inundation. And the point that Osamu and I are really trying to get across is that we need to really start honing in and thinking about housing stock. The impacts of hurricanes, of storm surge, of increasing flood risks are happening within the context of an affordable housing crisis in the country. And we need to better understand what kind of housing is at risk, how much it costs when we start to think about whether people are moving and where they might be moving to. So for this analysis, our research question was really, if homeowners were interested in a buyout after Hurricane Sandy and they received fair market value for their home, what would their local housing options have looked like? So we used some data from the Governor's Office of Storm Recovery. I want to thank them for their generosity there. Some housing market data from redfin.com. And the assumptions that we have is that the fair market value is used to determine a buyout offer as well. So our methods, we're not demographers like Matt. It's been really fun learning from him. I have more of a background in geospatial analysis, so I'm primarily utilizing geographic information systems to run these analyses. So we wanted to examine which neighborhoods buyouts were offered in, join that data with zip codes that have information about median listing or median sale price, and then bound the analysis of availability to that 8-mile buffer that Osamu was talking about in terms of people's rehousing preferences, and then look at how many homes were available in those neighborhoods in the years that people might have been looking to relocate. So just as a quick analysis, just zooming out. So here we have on the left, gross or buyout applications by zip code. You can see darker means more buyouts, lighter means fewer buyouts, as well as the median sale price as of October 31st in 2012, which is the same month Hurricane Sandy happened. And you can see up at the top, we do not see a significant correlation between median sales price and the number of applications and zip codes. So that was one of our very initial questions that we had. It doesn't appear that that is a determining factor for people's interest in applying for a buyout, at least with the data that we have. Also, we wanted to try to better understand what percentage of buyouts were actually going through the process and where in the status were they. For example, what percentage of incomplete versus complete were there? Median sales price also does not appear to be a driving factor for the status of the application with the GOSER data that we have, but you can see here it ranges from about 47 to 87% incomplete, which means that at least 50% of households usually either withdraw or cancel their applications. So we looked at 2 zip codes we wanted to compare. The first was in Mastic Beach, where the median sale price as of October 2012 was $115,000. There's a great examination of Mastic Beach in Lincoln Institute for Land Policy's Buy-in for Buyouts. If you haven't read that resource, we really recommend that you do. It's really helpful for framing the decisions that municipalities face in implementing buyout programs. And here, these are the outcomes for our analysis. You can see here that Mastic Beach, the median sale price in 2012 was about 104, so between this $104,000 and $115,000. The blue ring is the 8-mile buffer, and you can see this is comparing other zip codes for the relative purchasing power of a household that might have been offered the median sale price in that zip code. So orange is between 100 and 150% purchasing power. And then once you get into the darker colors, you're looking at over 150% or 200%. And the numbers on the zip codes are the average or the median sale price during the same month for that homeowner, which basically means you get $105,000 offer from your for a buyout offer, and you're looking to relocate somewhere nearby. If your home is your only asset, it's nearly impossible for you to relocate. In comparison, we wanted to look at a higher income community, or at least somewhere where the median sale price was a bit higher than in Mastic Beach. And here you can see in comparison, a homeowner that would be offered the median sale price of a home in Lindenhurst in this zip code in October 2012 compared to October 2014 has much more choice in terms of the purchasing power of their property or what their buyout offer would be for the surrounding areas as well. And here, just to zoom out to the county level where those incentives might have happened, you can see here, yellow is that Mastic Beach or below amount. And this lighter orange color would be somewhere in between what you could be offered in Mastic Beach versus in Lindenhurst. Everything darker than that is going to be outside of the purchasing power of households where their home is their only asset. So just some quick findings. First of all, fair market value is highly variable from season to season. So we're only using 1 month to make these assumptions. So we know that there's a lot of additional research that we can dig into there. And just to emphasize, this is totally speculative because we don't have data about why homeowners actually decided not to leave or not, how age, race, and income, as well as employment might influence that. And for future research, we really want to emphasize that asking people questions and tracking data about people's preferences or decisions to relocate or not is really important for trying to disentangle some of these questions that we have about immobility or strandedness.
This is from a separate project, but we just wanted to demo kind of what it might look like to ask people. This is from respondents in Missouri who live in a high flood risk area. What it means to actually ask people about their preferences for relocation, as well as what the main barriers that they currently perceive if they do want to relocate, what kinds of things might be their goals in undertaking a relocation, as well as what kinds of barriers might be preventing them from relocating. So we believe asking people who might be in this stranded state, what their interests are is the best way to really have a locally led buyout process. And so, I guess, just to go through some of these questions that we thought about as we were working on this example methodology. what are the similarities and differences between demographically stuck households, as Matt was describing earlier, and those that we would call stranded, and do the two intersect at all? So, I was thinking in particular about how the elderly tend to be the most vulnerable during to death during flooding events, and so, are there cases where the elderly people might prefer to move? And are there cases in which they're not able to because of the resources available to them? How do Matt and Isaac and Ross's work inform where households may move beyond our buffer or may want to move? So when we think about the pull factors, this is predominantly looking at the constraints on where people can move, but there might be people who don't have this preference for living nearby and would actually move to Florida or move elsewhere if they had this access to this funding. How can policy explicitly address the immobility of households who want to relocate, or what supplementary assistance is needed to enable relocation of households with sunk costs? How do mortgages and housing bubbles create additional immobilities? So some people might have noticed, $115,000 in Mastic Beach. I think the idea of buying a house anywhere in New York State for that much now is might sound absurd because housing prices have risen immensely, especially in the last year. And even in high risk areas. So the next question, kind of how does that incentivize or trap homeowners who want out? And might that result in gentrification? So, we're also aware that there's a lot of effort right now to make housing markets reflect flood risk more actuarially or more accurately. If those efforts are successful by, institutions like First Street Foundation to really have, flood risk being accounted for in people's home buying decisions, will there be a big price discount on flood prone homes? And how might that affect the mobility of those homeowners? Furthermore, there's some effort right now there's a new update to the National Flood Insurance Program and the flood maps that drive that, and how might that more actuarial reflection of risk affect the mobility of those homeowners? Because, what is the response then available to them if they are no longer able to, if some of them are no longer able to afford to move anywhere else? So that's our presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated getting to hear those insights. I think all of us are acutely aware of the housing crisis that is prevalent across the country. And so this question of where is the intersection between climate impacts and the housing crisis is something that comes up often in the work that ASAP is doing to bring this into the kind of relief look at migration and the buyouts was really helpful. So thank you for that. I think there's a lot of questions that we could dive into. We don't have a ton of time, but I do want to get back just to some of the questions which were coming up on the flood risk, which was being presented in Ross and Isaac's work. And so one of the kind of direct questions is, how was that flood risk being gauged? I certainly had questions about how Buffalo was higher flood risk than New York City, and whether proximity to the lake was the driving factor. Many folks who work on climate impacts in the Great Lakes region know that lake levels are one of the most confounding climate impacts to try to quantify, often called variable versus up or down. So curious where that flood risk is coming from. And then I'd love for the whole panel to talk about what we might need to be thinking about in terms of the risk of these kind of online tools that are out there, the climatecheck.com or First Street Foundation, and how we can use these tools but not exacerbate risk. But first to Isaac and Ross on where does that flood score come in?
Well, thank you, Beth. As we mentioned before, it comes from climatecheck.com. I have not recently looked over the algorithms that climatecheck.com uses, but I think you're correct in that we have to be very careful about quantifications. I really like to actually pull it back to Matt Howard's great work, where he shows like, yeah, if you look at displacement without modeling age-related impacts, that it's not that far apart from base migration, but if you integrate age impact, it's very far apart. And I feel like a lot of quantification results kind of come from that, where someone leaves out one variable, the whole picture is distorted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
If I can just mention with Buffalo there, again, with Isaac mentioned, we're not sure like with climatecheck.com exactly what factors they look at, but I know looking at the design of Buffalo, it is low lying and very close to the lake, whereas with areas of New York, you saw that it had the low score, so it's mainly the outlying fringe areas that are the most climate susceptible. For the city of Buffalo itself, I know it's been posing itself as a climate haven just because of its northern position within the country. Perhaps when they look at it structurally, what sort of flood mitigation and work can they do within their redevelopment plans to be able to bring that type of score down and to be able to accommodate people moving into the city? It's a possibility. But for now, there's people moving out of the city consistently. So that's why we kind of looked at it as a climate pace that's pushing people out.
Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting. Yeah, kind of following that historic trend. And then I guess, that broader question to all of you, how do we as adaptation professionals, often climate translators, look at the suite of tools which are becoming more and more common and know how to decipher them and integrate them into decision making?
And to start us off, I have one thought which maybe addresses one of the comments about, isn't that the point of these new tools that show flood risk to have markets more accurately reflect risk? And I think part of the question and the motivation of this project in response to that is, what is the human cost of that change, that greater reflection of actuarial risk in the price of flood-prone housing? So it's not just a factor of, oh, this is a bad market. This is a market that's not accurately reflecting risk, but also, there's a lot of people who live in flood zones, maybe not by their own choice, maybe it's an inherited home, that are vulnerable to flooding. And does that actuarial risk change, does that actually limit the responses, the adaptive responses that are available to those individuals? And is there a responsibility of governments to enable those kinds of adaptive responses, as I think government failures have really set up a lot of this market being as imperfect as it is in the first place. So I think it feels a little cold to me to just say, oh, we need to just change the markets. We need to, and that it'll all sort itself out, because I think there's a real human casualty to that just playing out without any kind of government assistance to help people get out of those situations.
Yeah, I might just add one other thought that's related to that. Even with increasing knowledge about flood risk, and Redfin, for example, has started publishing data about where people are moving and collecting surveys from people who are looking for new housing. And more Americans are talking about climate playing a factor in where they're moving. But even despite lived experience of flood risk, there is sort of a cultural fixation on the idea that the price of housing, the home values will always go up, no matter what. And so I think information about risk alone is not really the major barrier that we're encountering. And I think that part of the work that we're trying to do is also say people don't necessarily need more information about how vulnerable they are, because people who have lived through recurring floods know how vulnerable they are. And trying to ensure that, for example, a buyout or relocation assistance permanently removes that asset from the market is something that we also think is really important, because we see a lot of, in Houston, it was a big issue that developers would come in and buy homes for pennies on the dollar and flip them. And without a buyout, a mechanism for permanently removing those assets from the market, we're going to continue perpetuating this cycle of destruction and reconstruction. So yeah, it's not just about risk identification as well.
And then, of course, we have the compounding issue that we have a housing crisis on our hands. So when we take housing off the market, even if it is housing which is suboptimal, we then have to be in a position that we're putting new housing and, in fact, more housing back onto the market someplace that's affordable. I have a couple questions that I want to ask. I'm going to demur from my moderator power, though, because I've seen one question coming in repeatedly, and I think it's a very important question to put out there. And I think you've all been thinking about this, of what are the impacts, what impacts will climate migration have on homelessness and affordable housing? And we're kind of talking around that. I just want to put that question straight out and hear, what are your takeaways from these projects and also researchers in this space?
Well, as someone who likes to bring it home to answer questions, one example I always think about when it comes to climate migration and homelessness and housing crisis is what happened in Paradise Fire and the climate refuge internally placed people who had to move to nearby Chico. At Chico, saw its homeless rates skyrocket. It saw housing prices skyrocket because there's much more pressure. There's a flood of people, not enough supply. It's like, how can you fill up your barrel from a waterfall, right? And I think that with the advent of climate change, we're going to be seeing a lot more unhoused people. We're going to see a lot more stress for new housing, and unfortunately, I think this country has the deluge of housing construction, and we really have to think about where we're going to place housing, how we're going to build it, and how affordable will it be.
Yeah, go ahead, Kelly.
Ross, do you want to respond? You haven't spoken yet. But
I was just going to echo Isaac's words there. That's kind of what inspired the focus on our project, was really to try and find those regions where the housing and initiatives could be looked at that are in more climate safe regions. I know everyone's kind of questioning the viability of the climate check stats, but it works well as a guideline to try and find where those regions are for that focused investment so that we can better plan where we're going to be building those housing elements to house people who are going to be at risk. You can go ahead, Kelly.
Thanks. I think, and I saw another question come up that I wanna also answer while we talk about this, which was about.
We have to wrap that up maybe into this response if you want to just tee it up, because we do need to start moving into our final presentation.
Yeah, totally. So it was about whether or not we really need to replace housing or we can just adapt in place. And so I think what's really underappreciated is that in addition to impacts on housing, we're seeing increasing impacts on municipal infrastructure, stormwater infrastructure, saltwater intrusion, roads that are being eroded. And it costs a lot more than just improving homes or adapting homes to be able to help municipalities maintain their tax base and really have communities that remain livable. So it might not result in immediate homelessness per se, but I think that the issue of substandard housing and declining or receding municipal services in areas that are highly vulnerable, especially for low-income municipalities, is going to be a major issue. It's just about a decreasing quality or declining quality of life overall in some of those places. So I just wanted to bring up that bigger picture sort of municipal scale issue as well.
I really appreciate you doing that for us and kind of bringing it up from this single homeowner to this is something that is about our whole public good, and we need to be thinking about it. I think that goes into the questions of also potentially with those flood risk scores. We know that there's flood risk all over. However, is the infrastructure able to sustain what are the incoming climate impacts? For many of us who work in the Great Lakes region, we know that our stormwater systems are woefully undersized and perhaps not even built in the first place when there are CSOs to be able to accommodate what is already happening here. So how will we take all that into account as we go forward? Thank you so much for your presentations. I really appreciate getting to learn from you. I'm glad that you're going to be here for the rest of our conversation this afternoon. And I do want to move us along because kind of scaling up and talking about that broader perspective Our final presentation is on the perspectives, challenges, and data needs for climate and migration in the Great Lakes region. I'm thrilled to be welcoming Susan Eco, the Adaptation Fellow with the American Society of Adaptation Professionals. Susan leads ASAP's work preparing Great Lakes communities to receive climate migrants. She designs and facilitates conversations with stakeholders and Indigenous rights holders to support the development of methodologies to predict and plan for climate migration. And she's worked with a variety of partners within and adjacent to the ASAP network to share findings and implications for in-migration planning in the Great Lakes region. Susan has been bringing this bird's eye view, ensuring that in ASAP's work, we are grounding what we do with the experiences, the knowledge, and the wisdom of the people who are here in the region today, so that as we are finding out new information, collecting new data, we know how we're going to be empowering and enabling people to own that data and be full partners and leaders in where our region is heading. And so, Susan, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for your work. And with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I will be sharing with you today about perspectives, challenges, and data needs for climate immigration in the Great Lakes region. As Beth said, my name is Susan Eco. I am ASAP's Adaptation Fellow, and I support ASAP's climate migration work. So far, within today's session, you've learned about data, you've learned about methodologies, you've learned about housing and all of these things. But also really important is trying to see and situate it within the actual perspectives of people within the region to see how they view climate migration and what they communicate as the needs that they have in terms of climate immigration. First of all, I'd also like to thank our focus group participants who have really provided the insights that have been helpful for us as we've designed this project and conducted those conversations. And so, like I said before, our project activities have been focused on methodologies for predicting domestic migration within the Great Lakes region. And the third part of our project activities really is about outreach and education opportunities, which is why you're here today. But the second part is what I'll be focused on during this presentation, which is really to gather the stakeholder and Indigenous rights holder perspectives on the topic of climate-induced immigration within the Great Lakes region. And so this work has been determined by the literature review that ASAP conducted within the past year. And so what that literature review revealed was based on conversations we've already had today about how the Great Lakes region is really projected to be a climate destination for several reasons, one of which is obviously access to abundant fresh water, the capacity in terms of the cities to accommodate population growth, as well as other opportunities that have been identified. The literature review also showed that there's the need to develop these methodologies to predict climate immigration to the Great Lakes region. At the same time, while we have all of these opportunities, there's also aging infrastructure within the Great Lakes region that poses itself as a challenge. We also have legacies of injustice, which relate to things like from the Great Migration, also considering things like discriminatory and housing and education policies that have impacted the region, white flight as well, and segregation that has really contributed to the incidences of injustice within the region. But what the literature review found was that there's the need to center affected communities as we develop these methodologies and as we plan for climate immigration. And so the strategy that we used for this project was, the first thing was to conduct intermediary conversations. So we identified partners. These are people who provided some contextual information to the things that we were interested in finding out about the perspectives of people within the Great Lakes region. So we got feedback on our protocol that had been designed from these intermediaries. We also were able to identify and select participants that will be invited for the focus group conversations. And then the second part was the actual focus group conversations. We chose focus group conversations because it was important to be able to really take advantage of group interactions to see where perspectives align, see where perspectives differed within and across stakeholder groups. We also looked at details on different practices and perspectives that each of these groups and participants were bringing into the project. And so the intermediate conversations that we had were about 5 of them. We also had specific focus group conversations with community-based organizations and environmental justice organizations. We also had with natural systems managers, local governments, state governments. And then for the tribal representatives, we only were able to do intermediary conversations with tribal representatives. We established those relationships, but we didn't have enough time within the project up until this point to actually conduct those focus groups with tribes and tribal governments. And so we had about 20 people in total represented across all focus groups. And then the states that were represented within the people that attended include Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, Illinois, Ohio, and New York State. And so I will just start by sharing with you some results from the conversations that we had with tribal intermediaries. And so this is basically showing us some of the perspectives in terms of how tribes may be, indigenous rights holders may be impacted by climate immigration, one of which is the ability to exercise species rights. So especially as species shift their ranges, so thinking about things like moose, cold water fish, that has impacts on tribal communities and their abilities to exercise their species rights. Another concern is land use and access. So this relates to the way public lands and federal lands are being used and the rights of tribes to be able to exercise their rights to these lands. There's also pressure from real estate development, where increase in population leads to the need for more housing and how that might impact tribes in terms of taking land and issues like settler colonialism. Also, in terms of the stewardship of natural resources, whereby resource extraction and degradation to accommodate increased population growth might affect natural resources that tribes depend on. And also one question that remains out there is really what data is the most relevant for tribes as they begin to think about climate migration or think about climate change impacting their communities in general. Sorry, I'm trying to move to the next slide. Okay, so next I will share with you about some shared perspectives from the conversations that we had with our participants in the focus groups. So like I mentioned, we had governments represented, we had community-based organizations, businesses, and natural systems managers. One of the biggest themes that came out of this focus group conversations is the question of who is moving. So this is something that Matt's presentation touched on. It's important to understand who's moving so that proper planning can be made. So thinking about the movement of wealthy migrants, people moving in that are of high income will have different implications for people that currently live within the region. So wealthy migrants, according to natural systems managers, are more likely to have second homes. In terms of governments are also interested in seeing whether this migration is domestic or international. People coming from outside borders, or people are coming from within the United States. Labor benefits is also another key theme, whereby among governments and businesses, they really are optimistic about climate immigration based on the conversations that we had, and seeing it as an opportunity for people to be engaged in the workforce, but not only considering the benefits to the region, but also benefits to migrants in terms of being able to provide jobs for people who have to move. At the same time, community-based organizations and environmental justice organizations share some sort of pessimism with climate immigration when we think about who is moving. Because when we have wealthy migrants moving, what does that have? What implications do that have for people who are currently within those regions, in thinking about historically disadvantaged communities, and how issues such as gentrification might occur, access to jobs, so who will have access to jobs and economic opportunities. All of these things are concerns that were shared among the various stakeholder groups. In terms of data needs, so data is a critical part when we're thinking about climate immigration, and we've already talked about how we model climate immigration to be able to predict where people are moving to and who's moving. But at the same time, the use of demographic data in terms of climate change planning, and specifically climate immigration planning, is not uniform across stakeholders. So there are certain stakeholders that have easy access to the data. They know where to get the data. They're currently using such data. But at the same time, there's that acknowledgement that demographic data for predicting climate immigration is really useful across the board. So for community-based organizations thinking about knowing the income demographics of people that are moving, also thinking about age demographics, gender as well, can help these different stakeholders and groups plan better for climate immigration. Like I said before, demographic data really aids planning for population growth. That way, if we're thinking about things like labor, data will help us to know not only people who are moving in, but also to be able to figure out what their needs will be. So when we know the number of people that are moving in, it will provide more information that will help to plan around housing, plan around infrastructure investments, and all of these other necessary needs that migrants will have. Scenarios were also communicated as being helpful. So being able to understand different thresholds that will push different numbers of people to move and different groups of people to move will be helpful for planning. And so there's also the shared perspectives and needs in specific that were shared. So one of which is the climate vulnerability of the region. So it was shared across different stakeholders that flooding is an issue that needs to be considered. Also impacts on agriculture, the agricultural industry, how that impacts the food system within the region is also of concern. Also thinking about housing quality and how parts of the Great Lakes region have aged housing stock that need revitalization to accommodate population growth. We also have the need for infrastructural investment to support population growth. Most of these cities were built for a large number of people. And so we have like these huge roads and water systems. But at the same time, there's the need to be able to ensure that those infrastructures are maintained and are able to accommodate people moving in. Collaboration was a very big thing that cut across various stakeholder groups, whereby there's the need for cross-institutional and cross-governmental partnerships to prepare for climate migration. This aids with the integration of new migrants and specifically helps with knowledge transfers between things like people like farmers, local and international immigrants. And also that partnership really helps with exchanging data and information, but also funding, being able to know and get access to funding is also important. And so some challenges of climate immigration that were expressed during the focus group conversations, which is really the exacerbation of historical and current injustices that are being faced by many parts of the Great Lakes region. So thinking about how climate immigration can affect, can cause or exacerbate things like gentrification, whereby we have wealthy people moving in, and what does that mean for neighborhoods that may need to be transformed as housing developments take place to accommodate population growth and high income migrants moving in. What does that mean for communities? Also, the possibilities and potentials for exacerbating racism and xenophobia with new people moving in. What does that mean? If these are people of color, these are communities of color, what does that mean? Or even in terms of like international migration and xenophobia against the other people who are moving from outside might be an issue. Settler colonialism is also something that emerged, which really talks about taking away land from tribes and how, you know, like I mentioned before, the spike in investment in real estate markets can really cause this ripple effect of lands that might be taken away from tribal communities. There's also challenges associated with forest resources, where forests there might be deforestation to be able to accommodate new infrastructure and new housing developments, and how does that impact the ecosystem? So thinking about the increase in proliferation of invasive species. Also thinking about social integration. So when people are moving in, what does that mean in terms of integrating communities that are already existing with communities that are moving from outside in? And how that might be a challenge. Also community buy-in. So are people gonna be accommodating of people moving in terms of being partakers in planning for people moving in? So having that community buy-in is also important. And I'll just conclude by saying that the work that we did with this focus group conversations really demonstrates the need to engage with various stakeholders. That's a really key point. Demographic data is also a key need for climate immigration, to be able to understand who is moving and the different demographic factors and characteristics of those groups of people that are moving in. It's also important to center justice and equity as we think and plan for climate immigration, realizing that certain groups might be disadvantaged by climate immigration. But the important thing is also knowing that with good planning, climate immigration can be a good thing and not necessarily a bad thing. So the key thing there is in the planning. So thank you so much, and I welcome questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Susan, for giving us that overview of the conversations that you've been leading and insights and perspectives that you've been bringing together. Just to have some questions about where we are in this process. I'm curious if you have thoughts about what perspectives we have not yet captured through these focus group conversations.
Yeah, I would say that even though we had conversations with tribal intermediaries, it was also important for us to really go down and really get the perspective of tribal communities themselves and having their voice represented in this work. I would also say that we did make moves and efforts. One thing to understand when we're doing these types of projects is like our timelines might not necessarily be the timelines of communities that we're engaging with. So having that in mind is really important. But having that open dialogue and building those relationships is important, which is what we try to do with this work so far. So moving forward, this project gets expanded or modified in some ways, those open lines of relationship and communication are there.
So one of the questions that came in from the chat was a question of, from the interviews and focus groups that were happening with community-based organizations and EJ organizations, what were their perspectives on migrants who may be coming from low income, moderate income backgrounds, migrating into their communities?
So that's a very good question. One thing that emerged during the conversation was there was this level of pessimism when, the idea was maybe that wealthy people will be moving in. But when, the conversation went to a direction of really thinking about a broad spectrum of people who might be able to move, there was that optimism or accommodation for really understanding that people will need to leave places that are vulnerable. And this might involve people that are equally vulnerable and not necessarily these wealthy, high-income people that might disrupt existing systems within communities. So there is more of that acceptance of low-income people moving in rather than like really wealthy people. And I want to emphasize that this is based on the histories that these communities have experienced. So they're sharing these based on their experiences and importantly, not wanting those things to be replicated in the future. And so that's where that's coming from.
That's really helpful. I love that insight. I wonder, did you find that there was a different perspective from other focus groups who were reluctant to any kind of migration? And I don't know if you could speak to the way that different focus groups were reacting to and perceiving the risk or opportunity from different migrant groups who may come to the region.
Yeah, I think that's why it's very important to have various perspectives, because speaking with representatives from cities like Minnesota, for example, those cities are cities that have historically relied on international immigrants to move in to their cities, and they have that long line history. And so when we're talking about climate migration, they tend to approach it from that frame of really accepting that more people will be moving across borders. But at the same time, you have other people who necessarily see it from a domestic migrant perspective. So it just depends on where they're coming from, their experiences, how they've engaged with migration in the past, and thinking about how climate change might also like be a factor in terms of this movement. But overall, there seems to be, while there is that acknowledgement of the challenges that might come about from climate and migration, there's also the acknowledgement of the potential opportunities that climate and migration might bring for the region itself, for several reasons which have been mentioned already, like population decline in some of those cities, where they could really use that population growth if it's planned for properly. At the same time, having this natural resources and just the opportunity for economic growth that could come with population growth.
Yeah. I was going to ask one more question, and it sort of goes to, I know in the course of this work, you have been leading us through at times that has felt like almost finding like who holds this information, who wants this information. We've talked with local government, we've talked with county government, we've talked with regional governments. There's a question that's come in through the chat about, did any of the focus groups discuss the barriers that they faced when trying to collaborate across scales and actors or across scales of government?
Yeah, that actually emerged, whereby one thing that was mentioned was mainly relating to funding opportunities, specifically, and how there's that need for partnerships to be able to leverage funding, but that has not always been successful. So that's one avenue whereby collaboration hasn't been effective. One thing, though, that I will mention that really emerged from several of the focus groups was really how, research institutes or like universities play, and how they see that they have a huge role to play in terms of the access to data, access to information that many of these groups need to be able to plan better for climate and migration.
Susan, thank you so much for bringing this portion of the work forward and for your leadership in this. It's been incredible to get to kind of be alongside you as you've led these conversations and bringing more voices and perspectives into the work so that we can ensure that as this work evolves, those who own, who are in this region, who are the rights holders, who are the stakeholders, also will be able to control the data and the sort of emerging science. So thank you so much for all of your work. We are reaching towards the end of our time together, and I want to just first say a thank you to all of the experts who we've heard from today: Matt and BJ, Kim and Alex, Kelly, Osamu, Rachel, Isaac, Ross, and Susan. And I mean, I'm just struck by a few thoughts. You know, there's obviously so much that we still need to explore as we're imagining how can migration take place across multiple scales. I have questions that I'm dying to get back to about that governor's office of storm recovery, about why it was county only to allow for movement. I know there's probably a lot about FEMA and how dollars flow post disaster that keep us in one place versus being able to move to another place. I'm really interested in the way that we continue thinking about coordination and collaboration. We've been part of conversations at ASAP, which have brought us from talking with the city of Ann Arbor to the to Washtenaw County, to the Southeast Michigan Council of Governments, and in each place really finding folks who are hungry for this conversation, people who are reluctant and resistant to this conversation, and each one of those perspectives is really driven from some cases wanting better concrete data, some cases just a fear of what will change mean for us. I think that this work is helping us to break down a unnecessary kind of black and white question of is the Great Lakes region vulnerable to climate change, or is it a haven and an opportunity zone? To me, it's always been a both and. In order for us to get to that opportunity, it means addressing the climate risks which are with us and will continue to be with us today. But I'm, despite myself, sometimes an idealist and an optimist. And I think that this region is bountiful in what it has in terms of its people, its resources, its cities, its water. And so I look forward to how we will continue exploring this conversation of migration. And that conversation is going to be continuing into tomorrow. So we're going to be back tomorrow from 12 p.m. Eastern to 3 p.m. Eastern. And during these sessions, we're going to be talking about supporting effective in-migration planning. We're going to be hearing from practitioners, government staff, and community leaders, as well as business leaders and researchers, about how we can be thinking of our infrastructure, housing, and labor needs across the region. It's really an incredible and dynamic group of people who will be joining us tomorrow for those conversations, stretching from New York City to Minneapolis, and really getting a breadth of what is happening in this region and those who are on the front lines of the climate migration work and conversations. Before we sign off, for those of you who may not yet be as familiar with ASAP, I want to encourage you to join us. When you join ASAP, you become a member of the network. You have access to resources, to colleagues, to connections, much of which look and feel like the discussions and the resources which we have gone through today. You can join ASAP as an individual member. You can join ASAP as an organizational member, as an academic institution, as a company, as a nonprofit, or as an agency, all ways that you can build the capacity for yourself and your colleagues to be at the cutting edge of climate change adaptation conversations. And so with that, I want to thank everyone for their time today, our speakers for their time putting this together, and a special thank you, of course, to Rachel Jacobson and Susan Echo for all of the work you have done leading this project until now. And I look forward to seeing everyone back here tomorrow afternoon for the continuation of our conversations. Thank you so much.